Let me begin today with something I want you to consider carefully for a moment, because I believe that most of you, myself included, have completely misunderstood this war. And the reason we have been wrong is not because we are unintelligent, it is because the way this conflict is presented in the media is systematically designed to make us look at the wrong thing. So this is what I want to do today. I want to take what everyone is talking about, the airstrikes, the missiles, the oil, and I want to show you what is really underneath all of that, the structural logic, the hidden architecture, and then at the end I will give you 3 very specific predictions about what will happen next, with specific signals to pay attention to so that you can verify those predictions for yourselves. Alright, that is the plan, but first, yesterday morning, let us start there. Yesterday morning the Washington Post published an article citing an internal assessment from several United States intelligence agencies. And I want to be very precise here because the source matters. This was not a leak from a disgruntled official, it was a coordinated assessment by the intelligence community, the kind that is circulated at the highest levels of the U.S. government. And its conclusion, the CIA's conclusion, the conclusion of U.S. intelligence, was this. The United States and Iran are trapped in an indefinite limbo between peace and war. An indefinite limbo. Those are the words. Now, let me give you the full context so that you understand why those words are extraordinary. The United States has just completed the 11th consecutive night of airstrikes against Iran. 11 nights in a row without a single day of rest. As of this morning they have spent 37,500,000 on this conflict. This figure comes directly from Defense Secretary Pip Hegvey, who testified before the United States Senate Armed Services Committee and confirmed it under oath and then, in the same testimony, requested $67,100 million more. Let me repeat it slowly. $37,500 million already spent, $67,100 million more requested. More than $100,000 million in total for a war that President Trump told the American public would be quick, decisive, and not particularly costly. And at the same time, exactly at the same time, this money is being spent, these bombs are being dropped, these missiles are flying, the CIA is privately telling the government that they cannot win. Does that make sense? Because it should not make sense unless you understand what is really happening underneath. And that is what we are going to analyze today. A brief clarification before I continue. Everything I am going to tell you is based on publicly available information. I could be wrong. I will give you the sources, I will explain the logic, and I strongly encourage you to challenge me wherever you see a discrepancy. This is not false modesty. This is how this kind of analysis should work. Alright, let us get into it. To understand why this war is at a stalemate, you first have to understand the mechanism. Why does the most powerful military in history, dropping bombs every night for 11 nights, end up being told by its own intelligence community that it is in an indefinite limbo? How is that possible? I want to offer you a framework for understanding this. I call it the mechanical escalation trap. And once you understand this framework, I promise you will recognize it in every major military conflict of the last 50 years. This is how the trap works. When a great power launches an air campaign against a state that has deliberately decentralized its military structure, the air campaign creates a paradox. Every target destroyed generates new targets because the enemy disperses and adapts. Every escalation forces the other side to match or surpass it, because backing down means losing domestic political legitimacy and there is no clearly defined political end state. There is no specific condition you can point to and say, that is when we stop. So the machine keeps running. You attack, they counterattack. You attack harder, they counterattack harder. The target list expands, the geographic scope expands, the cost expands automatically. A former U.S. Pentagon official named David DeRoses described this dynamic precisely, and I quote verbatim, as a mechanism of mechanical escalation. It is an expression that describes a mechanism of mechanical escalation like a gear that only moves forward and never backward. And that is where the United States and Iran now find themselves, both trapped in a mechanism that neither can easily reverse without losing prestige. What is the United States doing, and why is it not enough? The United States Central Command, CENTCOM, carried out its 10th and 11th consecutive nights of airstrikes on July 21st and 22nd. Officially, they targeted Iranian military command centers, maritime interdiction capabilities, radar and air defense systems, unmanned aerial vehicle launch platforms, and ballistic missile infrastructure in southern Iran. The most symbolically significant individual strike during this period was the attack on a nuclear facility in Kharkov in Khuzestan province. Iran had been building this plant for years and now it is destroyed. I will return to the strategic implications of that attack later because they are not what you think. On the high seas, the USS Boxer and the amphibious assault ship disabled a merchant vessel and forced 7 others to divert their routes away from the Strait of Hormuz. The Supreme Command publicly claims that it has provided safe passage to 900 merchant vessels carrying a total of 450 M0001 barrels of crude oil since operations began. All of that sounds impressive. 11 nights of bombing, an attack on a nuclear facility, a naval blockade being enforced. I want to acknowledge that because I do not want to minimize the scale of what the United States is doing. They are applying enormous pressure. The question is whether that pressure is translating into strategic results. And this is where the situation becomes complicated. This is what the U.S. military has not fully absorbed. Even after Vietnam, even after Afghanistan, even after Iraq, Iran completely decentralized its military command structure a long time ago. Each military region has its own chain of command, its own operational authority, its own contingency plans, and its own communications infrastructure that does not depend on Tehran. You can degrade central command in the capital and the peripheral units continue fighting under independent orders. The head no longer controls the body in the traditional sense. Shaken does not work against this structure. Decapitation strikes do not work against the structure. The United States learned this in Iraq, they learned it in Afghanistan, and yet here we are what Iran is doing and why it is working. Now let us look at what Iran has been doing during the same period, because this is where it becomes truly fascinating from a strategic perspective. While CENTCOM was carrying out its strikes, Iran executed phases 21 and 22 of what they officially call Operation Measure 2 and Phase 21 of Operation C. These are not informal attacks, they are numbered and named operational phases. This is a pre-planned campaign being executed according to schedule in Bahrain, the CENTCOM data center, a Patriot missile battery and a radar at Shai Air Base in Kuwait, a Patriot system and a radar at Ali Al-Selim Air Base. In Jordan, a C-17 military transport aircraft and AP-8 maritime patrol aircraft at Aqaba Airport were described as severely damaged by missiles used. Hyperbaric FAT-110 Sulfagar Ahmad. These are precision ballistic missiles with single-digit meter accuracy. And here is the quote I want you to remember. Trump himself said publicly about Jordan. They succeeded in Jordan. If we had had other operators, that would not have happened. An Iranian ballistic missile struck a U.S. military aircraft at a Jordanian airport in a war that is supposedly going well. ORM, not a drop of oil. Now we need to talk about the single most important variable in this conflict, not the airstrikes, not the missiles. A body of water 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard has issued a formal statement. Not a drop of oil, not a single package of chemical fertilizer will be exported while U.S. aggression continues. On July 21st, an oil tanker was hit and the crew had to abandon ship. 2 other vessels exploded while attempting to transit the strait. CENTCOM says they have escorted 900 ships through. So, is the strait open or not? Here is the simplest test you can apply. Look at the price of oil. Brent crude is above $91 a barrel. If the hormones were really working, if 900 ships were transiting freely, that price would be impossible. It would be at $65, maybe $. Oil at $91 is a financial market price that values the real risk of a sustained closure. The market does not have a propaganda agenda. The market price is reality, and the market is telling you that the strait is not completely open. The double choke point strategy. But here is the problem. Almost no one is connecting it. Hormuz is only half the problem. Iran is carrying out what I call a double choke point strategy. Choke point 1. Hormuz, 20% of all crude oil traded worldwide passes through here every day. All the oil from Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Iraq, goes to Japan, South Korea, China, India, and much of Europe. Iran is intercepting it. Chwangu Bab el-Mandeb, where Yemen's Houthis coordinate closely with Iran, have just declared a maritime blockade against Saudi Arabia, threatening any vessel that arrives at Saudi ports. BAV, the Mandab is the escape valve. When Hormuz is dangerous, Saudi Arabia exports through the Red Sea. Iran is trying to close both exits simultaneously. If this strategy works, even partially, 25% of all oil and gas transported worldwide will be blocked. Gasoline prices in the United States are already reaching $4 per gallon, reaching $435 in some states. The U.S. midterm elections will be held in November. Iranian strategists know this calendar perfectly well. The coincidence is not accidental. Now I want to show you the most important signal of the last 48 hours, one that almost every media outlet is overlooking. While the United States bombs Iran every night, it is simultaneously pushing a trilateral framework agreement, the United States, Israel and Lebanon, that requires Israel to withdraw from the test zones in southern Lebanon and the disarmament of Hezbollah. Trump personally met with Lebanese President Joseph Aoun at the White House during those same 48 hours. Here is the underlying strategic logic you will not hear on CNN. Iran's most important leverage in any potential negotiation with the United States has always been Hezbollah, not the nuclear program, but Hezbollah. Any comprehensive agreement Iran might sign, the framework being negotiated through the Qatar Islamat Memorandum of Understanding, explicitly requires that any ceasefire include Lebanon. Iran has linked both theaters. Lebanon is Iran's insurance policy at the negotiating table. So when the United States decides to resolve the Lebanon situation bilaterally, independently of negotiations with Iran, the strategic effect is that they take away Iran's most valuable card before it can use it. They are saying, "We have taken care of Lebanon ourselves. Now come to the table with one less source of leverage." That is smart, but the fact that they feel compelled to do it is itself a signal. A country that is winning decisively does not need to neutralize the other side's diplomatic hand in advance. It simply keeps winning. The need to do this reveals the real pressure they are under. Former director of the National Counterterrorism Center Joe Kent has publicly stated that the United States has reached what he called a strategic dead end and that it cannot defeat Iran militarily. He is calling for immediate negotiations. Trump's approval rating is 36%. 60% disapprove. This is the lowest of his 2 terms combined, according to economist Yav polls conducted this week. At a Senate hearing, HGSDH was called a failure on live television. Senator Patty Murray noted that Trump has claimed more than 40 times that a deal is imminent and that the war is almost over. And now he is asking for $70,000 million more. Senator Gillibrand accused the administration of seeking unlimited money for bombs while cutting health care, housing, and support for American farmers. This is not a government that is winning. This is a government looking for a way to say that it won without actually having won. Alright, now let me describe a chess move Iran is making that I think is genuinely sophisticated and that almost no one in the English language media is fully explaining. When the United States attacked Dark Coven, Iran immediately filed a formal complaint with the Director General of the International Energy Agency, AIE, and the UN Security Council, calling the attack a threat to global nuclear security. The AIE's response was extremely lukewarm. They confirmed that no nuclear materials were present and stated that there was no radiological risk. Russia condemned the AIE for its blindness to the attacks. What is Iran really seeking through this exchange? Not protection. They do not expect the AIE to stop the U.S. bombing. What they seek is to establish an international record that the AIE is a biased institution. Why? Because the Islamabad Memorandum of Understanding, the framework for any possible agreement between Iran and the United States, contains a clause requiring Iran's enriched uranium to be diluted under an IAEA supervision mechanism. That is the fundamental verification clause. If Iran can successfully argue that the IAEA is politically compromised and Darkov's weak response gives them precisely that argument, then Iran has the legal and political basis to demand that the IAEA be completely excluded from any verification role in a future agreement. Yen has legislated internally that any IAEA inspection must receive prior approval from the Supreme National Security Council. This amounts to a tacit veto on inspections. This is a three-step sequence. Attack on Darkovan, weak response from the OJEA, Russian support for the Iranian version. And Iran uses this to eliminate inspection requirements from any agreement signed within 72 hours. Alright, now I want to do something I try to do in all my videos. Present the strongest possible version of the argument I disagree with, because you should always test an analysis against the best counterargument, not the weakest one. This is the strongest argument that the United States is winning. The U.S. military has destroyed Iranian infrastructure at an unprecedented scale and pace. Iran has lost senior military commanders. Peshkan has publicly acknowledged domestic inflation close to 90%, creating real political pressure. The Supreme Command claims that 900 ships have transited the Strait of Hormuz. There are signs of internal fracture in Iran, and no country can sustain a war against the world's leading military power indefinitely. Over time, economic degradation and internal instability accumulate. Iran will give in. That is coherent. Parts of it are true. I fully acknowledge that, but here are the specific points that argument cannot explain. Rebuttal 1. Iran has already rebuilt its missiles. The Wall Street Journal, based on satellite imagery and independent military analysis, reported this week that Iran has already reconstituted part of its ballistic missile capability after the U.S. and Israeli strikes. They continue launching ballistic missiles every day against U.S. bases in the region. If 11 nights of precision strikes were truly destroying Iranian offensive capability in a sustained way, those launches would be decreasing in volume and accuracy. They are not. The operational pace is practically constant. That is the key fact the theory that Iran will give in cannot explain. Rebuttal 2. The price of oil does not lie. CENTCOM says 900 ships. The price of oil says $91 a barrel. If you completely believe CENTCOM's figure, the price of oil makes no sense. If you believe the price of oil, CENTCOM's figure requires serious qualification. The financial market is not partisan. It prices prospective risk. Oil at $91 is the market price that values the real risk of the closure of Hormuz, which directly contradicts the narrative of successful navigation protection. Rebuttal 3. The arithmetic is ruthless. If the United States is winning, why does Hakes need 67,000 million more? 37. 5,000 million spent, 67. 1,000 million more requested, more than $100,000 million in total for a war that was supposed to be quick and decisive. And the result, Hormuz, partially blocked. Iran continues firing, there is no regime change. The CIA says there is an indefinite limbo. Senator Osaf asked Hex this question directly. There was no convincing answer. The arithmetic does not support the victory narrative. Why Iran will not break the lesson of malice. Let me go deeper into the psychology here, because I think this is the most important thing for understanding why the theory that Iran will eventually give in remains wrong. There is a story in ancient Greek history called the Melian Dialogue, recorded by Thucydides. The Athenians besieged the neutral island of Melos. They said, "The strong do what they can, the weak suffer what they must." The Melians believed that their moral argument and their neutrality would protect them. They were completely wrong. Athens killed all the adult men on the island and sold the women and children into slavery. Iran studied that history. They watched Gaddafi give up his weapons program in 2003 after an agreement with the West and be overthrown in a NATO-backed intervention in 2011. They watched Soleimani be killed by a U.S. drone in Baghdad in January 2020 in what was, in practice, a targeted assassination in peacetime. They watched Iraq, they watched Afghanistan. And they reached a single conclusion. The only way to survive against the United States is to make the cost of defeating you permanently and credibly greater than any possible benefit the United States could obtain from your defeat. Not to win, but to make winning not worth it. That is why they built the Shahed drone at $50,000 each, specifically to be intercepted by U.S. missiles that cost $1 million each. For every 20 drones Iran launches, it drains $20 million from the U.S. military budget. That ratio is built into the design of the engineered cost imposition strategy. That is why they dug underground fortresses into the rock of Kar Island and Sesh Island, controlling the approaches to Hormuz with what they call unsinkable aircraft carriers. They do not float, they do not move, and they cannot be sunk. And that is why Peshken can declare total war against the most powerful military in the world while acknowledging domestic inflation of 90%. Because the political cost of capitulating, of becoming the Iranian government that surrendered and ended up like Gaddafi, is in their calculation greater than the economic cost of continuing. That is a rational actor making a rational calculation under extreme pressure.
All right, Mountain Peak.
Why this threat is probably not a plan. Trump has said that he will attack Pickaxe Mountain soon and very hard. Kwanguk, near Isfahan, a reinforced underground nuclear complex. It sounds dramatic. Here is why I believe this is pressure rather than an operational order. 5 reasons. First, the geology. This facility is inside a mountain, not under soft ground. Even the GB-57 massive penetrator bomb, the deepest penetrating conventional bomb EU possesses, weighing 30,000 pounds and carried only by B-2 stealth bombers, might not guarantee penetration at this depth. Multiple sequential passes over the same penetration point in a contested air environment. Extremely high risk. Second, intelligence uncertainty. Trump himself said conditionally that the attack would make no sense unless they had nuclear material there. That means the CIA has not given him a high-confidence assessment that the stockpile material is present. You cannot bomb a nuclear site without knowing what you are bombing. Third, munitions logistics. Senior Pentagon officials have privately told journalists that the U.S. military does not have sufficient reserves to maintain the current daily operational tempo while simultaneously planning a major strike on a hardened facility. This is a physical limitation, not a political one. Fourth, the credibility of Iranian retaliation. The Kadima Alambia Command has explicitly warned that any attack on a nuclear facility means the expansion of the war across the entire Western Asia theater of operations. Iran has already demonstrated that it can simultaneously strike U.S. bases in Jordan, Bahrain, and Kuwait. That threat is credible. 5. The international radioactive nightmare. Russia, China, and European governments have privately warned Washington that attacking Iranian nuclear infrastructure carries the risk of a turmoil-type radiological event that would affect Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, and beyond. The geopolitical cost would be generational. Pickaxe Mountain is leverage Trump is using to pressure Iran. It is less likely to be an imminent operational plan. That is my assessment, held with moderate confidence. Before the predictions, I want to broaden the perspective because if you only understand events, you will be surprised every time something happens. But if you understand the structure that generates the events, you begin to see the next move before it is announced. Hans Morgan, one of the founding figures of modern international relations theory, wrote that great powers are always tempted to, quote, disguise their own particular aspirations and actions with the moral purposes of the universe. In plain language, powerful countries always find a justification that sounds moral for doing what they plan to do for strategic reasons. And the justification always sounds reasonable because it is crafted by intelligent people whose job is to make it seem reasonable. Look at the war with Iran. The United States says it is defending freedom of navigation, but the USS Boxer is blockading Iranian ports.